this lecture, we'll be talking about Trajan. We'll look at the highlights of Trajan's activities as emperor, and then talk a little bit about the changes in the relationship between Rome and the provinces under Trajan. So Trajan took office in 98. Remember from our previous lecture, he had been adopted by Nerva under some pressure from the Praetorian Guard. He had been adopted as Nerva's successor, and so the transition after Nerva's death in 98 was very smooth. And Trajan took office. He was away on campaign, but was proclaimed as emperor. It was ratified by the Senate in 98. As early as 103, Trajan starts to advertise himself and his character as the Optimus Princeps, and he does this on coinage in particular. The Optimus Princeps, the best Princeps, and in addition cultivated particularly good relations with both the Senate and the military. And this was key to his success, and we've seen in several instances, but most notably with Nero and then Domitian, the problems that come up when an emperor does not cultivate a good relationship with, in particular, the Senate, but also the military. That it was necessary for stable rule to have a good relationship with the Senate and have the Senate and the equestrian class be participants in governance. And it was also necessary to have a good relationship with the military to prevent any kind of military coup. Trajan also very wisely rejected Domitian's title Dominus et Deus, this master and God, that Domitian himself had adopted, and this really set Domitian very clearly above all other Romans. So, in essence, Domitian saying, I am your master, you are my slaves, I am a god, you are mere mortals. Trajan rejects this, recognizes that in terms of propaganda, in terms of cultivating a good relationship with the Roman people and with his fellow senators as well as the military, this title was going to alienate them. And he returns to the Augustan ideal of the emperor as princeps. So you'll remember from earlier lectures that Vespasian, when he took office, when he institutionalized the Principate, when he grounded it in the Roman constitution, he adopted the title of imperator. And he does this in part to distinguish his family dynasty, the Flavians, from that of the Julio-Claudians, who had identified themselves as principes, or leading men, where our word prince comes from. But Trajan returns to that Augustan notion of the emperor not as imperator, but as princeps. And it's an interesting move, given that Trajan was at heart a military man, and his rise to power was based on his military connections, and it's through his reign that he will act as a soldier, but in some sense realizes that he doesn't need to advertise his role as imperator, so adds that title of princeps, and also does this in order to distinguish now this new era, a dynasty that's not family-based, but rather is what we might think of as merit-based, that is through the adoption of deserving men, but to distinguish this new era of rulers from that of the Flavians, and to go back to Augustus in particular. Trajan practiced what was known as the beneficial ideology. He didn't invent it. This was something that Augustus himself had advertised, but in essence, the idea of a beneficial ideology is that the emperor fashions himself as a loving parent who takes care of his children. So the Roman people are children who need protection by the parent, and this is emphasized when, for instance, Augustus adopts the title of Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, and it's a title that other Julio-Claudians will also adopt. And it's very much contrasted with that title that Domitian took of Dominus et Deus, where the emperor fashions himself as the master of slaves. Trajan now is fashioning himself as a kindly parent, and not just for citizens of the Roman Empire who are living in Rome, but also for those who are living in the provinces. Among Trajan's activities, some of the most notable include his foundation of veteran colonies. One of the most magnificent is in North Africa, in the city of Timgad. This is a city that was fashioned in the most typical of Roman plans, so the orthogonal street plan on a grid. And it's often referred to as the prototypical Roman city. It's based on a military camp. So the streets that are formed in a perfect grid, this is what a military camp looks like. And it's in some way what Roman cities were meant to look like. The problem was that for most cities, they predated any kind of firm notion of city planning, and so the orthogonal plan was often mapped onto some pre-existing plan. So in Roman cities, we do see some version of an orthogonal plan, but nothing that is as fully recognized as in Timgad. And this was a city in which it was fully occupied by veterans who would then marry locals. And so very quickly it became a Romanized community. It gave Rome under Trajan a better presence in this important province of North Africa. So Rome had a colony already in Carthage, a city that was flourishing under Roman rule, under Trajan, but now we have another city in the west of Carthage, Timgad. Trajan also continues Nerva's policy of the alimenta, this child support program, and there's some view that Trajan does this in order to try to encourage an increase in the birth rate. There's not clear evidence that this was actually the case, but he certainly recognizes the value of Nerva's social welfare program and makes sure that it continues. He funded a number of public buildings and other kinds of works. Perhaps most famously, the Forum of Trajan, which remains standing to this day. You can go visit the remains of it. It's one of the imperial fora in Rome, and you can see how it was laid out by Trajan. This provided public space for the Romans to worship, for law cases to be heard, and for public gatherings of different sorts, as well as for Trajan to advertise, in particular, his military victory over the Dacians, and we'll talk more about the Dacians in a bit. He funded the construction of bridges and roads, and these were important foundational works. These helped to increase the infrastructure in the Roman Empire, and in particular, when these bridges and roads were undertaken in the provinces, they first and foremost allowed for the swifter movement of troops, and that was often the reason for their initial construction. But, of course, they remained, and they allowed for Roman citizens living in the provinces to move more freely, and especially to move around areas that had previously been inaccessible. This also encouraged trade, and so led to economic expansion on a local level. And then finally, Trajan builds the markets of Trajan, and this was the kind of ancient version of a massive shopping mall. This was a kind of mall of ancient Rome. It was, as you can see from the image that came up on your slide, the foundations of this remain. It was multi-leveled, so two of the levels remain. These were essentially storefronts where the arches are. And what this did was now allow for merchants of all different kinds to come to Rome, to come to the markets of Trajan and sell their goods. And people would go and do their shopping. And so part of what it did was act as an economic stimulus. And people from all over the empire would come and try to sell their goods in the city of Rome. But this was really, it would have been absolutely a buzz in antiquity as people were hawking their goods, people were negotiating prices and carrying home and just socializing with their fellow citizens who were also out shopping. So Trajan is perhaps best known as a military man, and this was how he rose to power, and it was really how he was able to fund the activities of his principate, in particular the public buildings, the Forum of Trajan, the markets, but also the construction of those roads and bridges. He conducted extensive military campaigns. Perhaps the most famous of them were his campaigns in Dacia. Dacia is in modern Romania, and one of the reasons why Romanian as a language is very Latinate is precisely because under Trajan, Dacia was a Roman province, and so the influence of Latin was strongly felt on the development of the native Romanian language. Trajan conducted the Dacian Wars relatively early in his principate, in the early hundreds, and these were wars he won decisively and greatly enriched Trajan himself and the Roman treasury at a time when the treasury needed money. Rome was still recovering from the fire of 64. Vespasian had done a fair amount to get the finances set back on a good road, but things were not the same as they had been sort of in the late Republic when we had Pompey, Caesar bringing back massive amounts of money from their military conquests. But Trajan follows very much in those examples when he conquers Dacia and is able to exploit the massive mineral wealth, in particular, of Dacia, but also brings back a number of slaves, so is able to greatly increase the number of the amount of slave labor in Rome. So the picture on the right-hand side of your slide here is the column of Trajan, and this was erected to commemorate Trajan's victory over the Dacians. And the story of his military victory is told in these panels that wind up around the column. And this is a military monument, a commemorative monument that acts in the same way as a victory arch, but in this case we have a column. So a bit of a variation on the victory arch. And this column stood in the Forum of Trajan, so when people came to that forum, one of the things that they would see was, in fact, this column celebrating Trajan's great victories. And they would be reminded that this is part of what was allowing Rome to prosper under Trajan. Trajan also annexed Arabia, so provided more, particularly mineral wealth, for Rome. And he conducted extensive campaigns in Armenia and in Mesopotamia, as well as against the Parthians, this old Roman enemy that was once again making incursions into Roman holdings. And like those before him, Crassus, Mark Antony, Trajan isn't particularly successful in conquering the Parthians, but he is able to hold them a little bit in check. He dies while he's out on campaign. He's in fact trying to make his way back to Rome after these extensive campaigns in the Middle East, in Asia Minor, but ends up dying in Cilicia, in the far reaches of the Roman Empire, in a town called Selinus, and in fact there's a monument there to commemorate Trajan. And he dies in 117. So he ruled for almost 20 years, so an extensive period of time that allowed him to put into place programs and to really see them through, to see the benefits of his changes. And it's under Trajan that the Roman Empire reached its greatest size. It would never be bigger than it was under Trajan. And this is often cited as a positive, but one thing to keep in mind is that after Trajan, it immediately has to shrink back. That in many ways, Trajan's military campaigns pushed the frontiers too far. That there was a certain limit. There was a cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day in which it became too expensive in terms of labor and also just resources to maintain these borders in the far reaches of the Roman Empire. And so future emperors would realize that in order to maintain the security of holdings, they needed to actually shrink the boundaries. They needed to bring in the Roman holdings. But it's under Trajan that we see the empire reaching its largest size. And here's an example. This is a panel from Trajan's column, but it's a panel that is showing Trajan making a sacrifice And in the background, we have the bridge that he built over the Danube River, a typical Roman arched bridge. So you build the arches and the bridge would sit on top of it. And this was an architectural wonder in many respects, but allowed Trajan to move his troops very efficiently to Dacia. But once it became a Roman province, it also allowed for the easy movement of peoples back and forth from Rome to Dacia and other parts of the Roman Empire to Dacia. So under Trajan, the provinces continued to be self-governing. They'd been self-governing since Augustus, so local governments made decisions and collected taxes, which were then paid back to Rome. But Trajan makes one significant change to this general practice, and that is that he appoints caretakers, what are called curatores in Latin, or the singular curator. This is where our English word curator comes from. So he appoints these curatores to manage specific problems that would arise. And these curatores were then to report directly to Trajan. So they didn't work through any kind of bureaucracy. They reported directly to Trajan. They were special deputies that were appointed in times of crisis or when some specific need arose for a Roman presence directly in the province. So one example of this, a very famous example, is Pliny, who is appointed by Trajan to go deal with reports of uprisings in Bithynia. And we know about Pliny's activities because reports of them are preserved in Book 10 of Pliny's letters, which is his correspondence with Trajan, mostly Pliny's letters, but also some of Trajan's responses. And it really preserves for us an example of how this relationship between emperor and curator would have worked. One of the major problems that Pliny deals with, he dealt with a lot of sort of minor problems, quibbles in various towns over the allocation of resources, over buildings, that kind of thing. But one of the major problems that he deals with is what to do with Christians who were in Bithynia and seem to be caught in the midst of some local politics where they are being used as scapegoats. And Pliny goes over and he immediately starts putting the Christians on trial, putting some of them to death, and then realizes that maybe the situation is a little bit more complicated than he had thought, and realizes that the Christians are being that people are being accused of being Christians as a way of internal politics being fought out. And so Pliny sort of realizes he needs to get Trajan involved. He writes back to Trajan, reports the situation to him, reports what actions he's taken, and asks for advice. And Trajan tells him, look, don't get involved. Let them manage their own affairs. Basically take the approach of don't ask, don't tell. So if somebody is going to insist on declaring themselves a Christian and declaring themselves disloyal to the Roman Empire, then you've got to deal with them. But otherwise, just stay out of it. And so this is one of the first examples of this general imperial policy towards Christianity of don't ask, don't tell. In general, Trajan's approach to provincial management was expansionist. He was very interested in expanding Roman holdings, in adding provinces. This, of course, would add taxes. It would add revenue. And part of why Trajan is interested in doing this is simply recognizing that the Roman Empire is in a state where it needs income, it needs money, it needs to replenish the treasuries after not just Nero and the Fire of 64, but also the building program of the Flavians. And Trajan's own building programs need to be supported. But one thing that Trajan is very careful about is at least portraying himself as not being exploitative, as having that beneficial ideology, as being a caring father towards his provincial children. The reality is that he was still fairly exploitative. I mean, he needed to get mineral wealth from Dacia, for example. Certainly there's an influx of slaves into the Roman Empire under Trajan. So it's not all roses for everybody. But in general, Trajan is very aware that he needs to, at least on the surface, give the impression that he is not just using the provinces, that he respects the provinces as, to some extent, equal partners in the Roman Empire, that they're not subordinate, but that they're partners. And he recognizes that partly to make sure that there aren't ongoing revolts, that part of provincial management is getting buy-in from the Roman provinces. And Trajan is remembered very, very positively. We don't have any contemporary sources of his reign. Suetonius, in his biography, stops with Domitian. It's possible that Suetonius would have written a biography that was somewhat less entirely positive than some of our later sources remember Trajan, but he is really remembered with that Optimus Princeps title that he himself perpetuated on his coinage very early in his reign. So in some ways his propaganda is successful, and later historians will remember him as a great emperor and one to be emulated. He's remembered by Christian writers as a virtuous pagan, and in some stories he's even converted to Christianity. And one of the sort of interesting things that comes out of Trajan's reign is that all future emperors are hailed by the Senate with the wish that they'll be Felicior Augusto Melior Traiano, translated luckier than Augustus or happier than Augustus and better than Trajan. So in essence, putting Trajan actually above Augustus himself. Augustus is cast as somebody who is Felix, which is an interesting adjective that also ties Augustus a little bit to Sulla, but as somebody who's sort of lucky or blessed, rather than simply talented. While Trajan is just better, and Melior is connected to that word Optimus in etymological terms, that there's some innate goodness to Trajan. And so the wish is that all future emperors will in some ways combine the best of Augustus and the best of Trajan.